Alright, back for another round of this. I, last week I decided to talk about Christ's love for others and how he loves everyone, no matter what their race, social status, wealth, or lack thereof. He loves everyone, and that's I'm gonna kind of build on that right now. Specifically in regards to Easter and the sacrifice that he made for us on the cross, seeing as how we just finished celebrating Easter. I want to talk about two Jewish traditions that Jesus made significant changes to, because he said, I have not come to abolish the law, I've come to fulfill it. And he fulfilled it in a couple of different ways. One specifically I'll get to later. But there's two traditional things that he made some major changes to. And the first one is Passover. Now, we all know that Jesus was crucified during Passover week. And he observed the Passover meal, but not exactly in the traditional sense. Now, the traditional Passover meal, you can read about the actual Passover event in Exodus 12, and there's different references to, there's different instances in which God tells his people to celebrate the Passover meal in Numbers 9 and Deuteronomy 16, if kind of for your own reading. But to summarize, the Passover is commemoration of the Israelites, the fact that they were spared from the so-called angel of death that God had visited upon Egypt during their time there. It was the final plague of 10 that God had delivered upon Egypt for not letting his people go from the slavery that they were in Egypt. And the Passover meal was to commemorate this. The meal that they ate during that night in which the angel of death passed over their houses, because they had smeared blood of a lamb, a spotless lamb, on their doorposts. Now, the meal consisted of unleavened bread, which was to symbolize the fact that the Jews were in a rush to get out of Egypt, because after this night, Pharaoh had lost his son to this angel of death, and he was angry with the Jews. He wanted them to leave. He wanted them out of there now. And so they left in a hurry, and so they ate bread with no leaven in it. They didn't wait for the bread to rise. They just cooked it and ate it. And so that's what the unleavened bread symbolizes, their haste to leave Egypt. The meal also consists of bitter herb. There may be this. This is to commemorate the suffering that they endured at the hands of the Egyptians. The beatings and the mistreatment and just slavery that they had to endure from the Egyptians while they were living there. I suppose you could say, main course of the Passover meal would be the lamb. And the lamb was quite clearly representative of the lamb that was sacrificed and its blood taken to put on the doorposts of their house to protect them from the angel of death on the night of the Passover in Egypt. And this was all washed down with wine, which each individual person had a cup of to drink, and this wine symbolized the blood that was put on the doorpost to save them on that night. Now, when you skip ahead to Jesus and what we would call the Last Supper that he shared with his disciples the night before, or I guess the night that he was betrayed by Judas Iscariot, he in at least two of the Gospels, in Mark and Luke, I think, mentioned that this was indeed a Passover meal, or it was considered a Passover meal. But there were some significant differences between this meal and a traditional Passover meal. Whereas the Passover meal had unleavened bread, a lamb, bitter herb, there was no lamb, there was no bitter herb, and in the original Greek language in which the New Testament was written, the word for unleavened bread is not used. The word for just bread is used, which doesn't necessarily indicate one way or another whether unleavened bread was used or not, but it seems to indicate that it was, for lack of a better word, irrelevant whether the bread was leavened or not. And so this was obviously a very different Passover meal. Also, a big difference was the fact that the meal was supposed to be taken with family. This was a family meal, but Jesus ate this meal with his disciples. Now, also the wine was shared among them. They didn't each have an individual glass. They passed it around. They were in unity, I guess. But significance of the absence of a lamb could be taken to represent that Jesus was presenting himself as the lamb, the sacrifice, and he became that lamb just less than a day later. Caiaphas, the high priest at the time, said it's better for one man to die than everyone, and I think he was referring to potential uprisings that Jews were kind of talking about, and he believed that Jesus was kind of behind that, was kind of egging it on, making it worse, and so he thought, okay, we'll kill Jesus, and that'll make everybody calm down, and nobody else will have to die. But he didn't realize that what he was saying had much more significance than just the Romans. Jesus became the one sacrifice for all people, for all time. And that brings me to, first I want to say that the Passover meal was changed forever. Jews around the world still celebrate Passover meal in the traditional way. But for us as Christians, Jesus, what we call the Lord's Supper or communion, came out of this meal that was seen as a Passover meal. And so out of the Passover meal came what we call the Lord's Supper. And that was basically the new covenant that God was making. That we were to, instead of remembering a release from captivity in Egypt, we were to remember the sacrifice that Christ made for our lives. And that is what we remember. That is what we commemorate whenever we take the bread and the cup. We remember his sacrifice, which was made once for all. Which brings me to thinking about the other big tradition that he kind of really made more of an allusion to than a change. The Day of Atonement is mentioned in Leviticus 16, chapter 16. And the Day of Atonement was the one day out of every year in which the high priest would make a sacrifice for all the sins of the people for that year. Now this was a kind of a multi-step ritual. The first step involved the high priest making a sacrifice for himself, for his own sins. This is indicative of the fact that no one is above God's law, not even his chosen high priest. The high priest must be held accountable to God just like everyone else. And so he would make a sacrifice for his own sins so that he would be sure that he was right with God, that his own sins were dealt with before he attempted to deal with the sins of the people. And so after he had done this, after his sin had been dealt with, he would choose 2 goats. One goat would be sacrificed, and its blood meant to cover the sins of the people. After he did this, he would take the blood on his hands from that goat, go to what they called the scapegoat, which is where we get that word from, and he would put his hands on this goat and confess the sins of the people. And then the goat would be released into the wild to presumably never be seen again. And that was the idea. Between these 2 goats, the sins of the people were covered and taken away. However, this was a temporary atonement. This lasted for a year, and that's it. The next year, they would have to do it again. And every year, they would have to do it again and again and again, because the blood of a goat could only cover so much. However, when Jesus came onto the scene, he became the perfect, ultimate, and final sacrifice for the sin of all people. Not just Jews, all people. And his blood, because his blood was holy blood, his blood was divine blood that was spilled by the hands of men in order to cover up and take away the sins of all people for all time. And that kind of a sacrifice, the fact that he would do such a thing, to think about the fact that God, the holy God who created the universe, was willing to become mortal, to become a man, to face the trials and temptations that men face, that human beings face all the time. He went through all of that, the suffering and the horribleness of humanity, all of that, just to die, and not only die, to die by crucifixion, which, as I mentioned in my last video, was probably the most horrible, gruesome, and terrible way to kill another human being that could ever possibly be conceived by the sick and depraved human mind. It was a horrible, horrible way to die. But that was the only reason he came to this earth, was for that moment when he would be put on that cross to become the final sacrifice for the sin of all people for all time. And such a sacrifice should make, once that really sinks in and you begin to really understand what that means and what he did and what he went through, and the love that he certainly has for us, in that he would do that for us, for me, for you, that deserves nothing less than our absolute devotion to him, to the one who gave his life for us. And when we really begin to understand that, then we'll get to the point where we can't really help but want to live our lives for him, and to, at the very least, be an example to others, to be like him, to live for him. There's really no other, I mean, there's no way for us to repay what he did. But the best we can do is to live our lives his way, because it's worth it, because of his sacrifice, this world has become our temporary home. And we'll get to see him in the not too distant future. That's why death is not so scary, because physical death here just means we get to go be with him physically. And that is incredible.